website, ntsb.gov, as well as on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and X at NTSB_newsroom. And reporters can always contact us through email at mediarelations.gov. Chairman?
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. The on-scene portion of our investigation into the January 29th mid-air collision near Reagan National Airport has wrapped up. We have the perishable evidence we need, so we want to provide an investigative update and talk about next steps. Let's begin with some information on the Black Hawk's route and then proceed through the accident sequence. This particular flight was a check ride for the pilot flying the Black Hawk. Generally, a check ride is a practical exam that a pilot must pass to be qualified to perform specific aircrew or mission duties. The Army does 3 types of check rides: instrument, annual, and night vision goggles. This was a combined annual and night vision goggle check ride. We believe the helicopter crew was likely wearing night vision goggles throughout the flight, given the nature of the flight. Additionally, had they been removed, the crew was required to have a discussion about going unaided. Let me repeat that. Had they been removed, the crew was required to have a discussion about going unaided. There is no evidence on the cockpit voice recorder, or CVR, of such a discussion. On this chart, you'll see the routes they were generally following: Helicopter Route 1 to Helicopter Route 4. These routes are designated by the Federal Aviation Administration, or FAA, and although you see blue lines, there are no defined boundaries to these routes. You'll note on the chart that pilots are expected to maintain the maximum altitude charted when ceiling permits, unless otherwise instructed by air traffic control. The maximum altitudes along Helicopter Route 1 are 1,300 feet between Cabin John and Chain Bridge, 1,000 feet at Chain Bridge, 700 just after Chain Bridge, 300 at the Key Bridge, and 200 feet just south of Memorial Bridge. Now I'm going to read some preliminary investigative information, which is derived from a variety of electronic and other sources as of 1 p.m. today. About 8:15 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, the CRJ left 37,000 feet pressure altitude for an initial descent. At 8:30, the Black Hawk began traveling generally southbound after maneuvering near Laytonsville, Maryland. CVR audio from the Black Hawk indicated the instructor pilot was the pilot monitoring and transmitting on the radio, and the pilot was the pilot flying. At 8:33:41, the Black Hawk crew requested Helicopter Route 1 to 4 to Davison Army Airfield, which the tower controller approved. At 8:38:39, the Black Hawk reached the intersection of the D.C. Beltway and the Potomac River near Carteret, Maryland. After briefly turning westbound, the Black Hawk turned back to the east and began descending as it picked up Helicopter Route 1 over the Potomac River southeast toward downtown Washington, D.C. At 8:39:10, Potomac approach cleared the crew of the CRJ for the Mount Vernon Visual Runway 1 approach. At 8:40:46, the CRJ rolled out of a left turn established on the ILS localizer for runway 1 at approximately 4,000 feet pressure altitude, 170 knots, with landing gear up and flaps extended to 20 degrees. At 8:43:06, the CRJ crew made initial contact with DCA Tower. The tower controller then asked if the crew could switch to runway 33. The CRJ crew agreed to switch to runway 33. At 8:43:48, the Black Hawk was about 1.1 nautical miles west of the Key Bridge. The pilot flying indicated they were at 300 feet. The instructor pilot indicated they were at 400 feet. Neither pilot made a comment discussing an altitude discrepancy. At this time, we don't know why there was a discrepancy between the two. That's something that the investigative team is analyzing. At 8:44:27, as the Black Hawk approached the Key Bridge, the instructor pilot indicated the Black Hawk was at 300 feet, descending to 200 feet. Between 8:44:41 and 8:44:45, the CRJ crew selected 30 degrees of flaps and then 45 degrees of flaps. At 8:44:49, the CRJ landing gear were down and locked. The aircraft was fully configured for landing about 6.2 nautical miles south of the airport. At 8:45:27, the autopilot was disconnected, and the CRJ began a shallow right turn off the runway 1 localizer at a radio altitude of approximately 1,700 feet and an airspeed of 134 knots. This occurred about 5 nautical miles south of the airport. At 8:45:30, the Black Hawk passed over the Memorial Bridge. The instructor pilot told the pilot flying that they were at 300 feet and needed to descend. The pilot flying said they would descend to 200 feet. At 8:45:58, the Black Hawk then crossed over the Washington Tidal Basin and followed the Washington Channel consistent with helicopter Route 1. It is now approximately 2 minutes before the collision. At 8:46:01, a radio transmission from the tower was audible on the CRJ CVR, informing the Black Hawk that traffic just south of the Wilson Bridge was a CRJ at 1,200 feet circling to runway 33. CVR data from the Black Hawk indicated that the portion of the transmission stating the CRJ was circling may not have been received by the Black Hawk crew. We hear the word circling in ATC communications, but we do not hear the word circling on the CVR of the Black Hawk. The recorders group is evaluating this right now. At 8:46:08, the Black Hawk crew responded. They had the traffic in sight and requested visual separation, which was approved by DCA Tower. At 8:46:29, the CRJ crew received a 1,000-foot automated call-out. At 8:46:47, DCA Tower cleared other jet traffic on runway 1 for immediate departure with no delay. At 8:47:27, or 32 seconds before impact, the Black Hawk passed the southern tip of Haines Point. A second later, the CRJ began a left roll to turn to final on runway 33. The CRJ was at a radio altitude of 516 feet and 133 knots. At 8:47:29, the CRJ crew received a 500-foot automated call-out. At 8:47:39, or 20 seconds before impact, a radio transmission from the tower was audible on both CVRs, asking the Black Hawk crew if the CRJ was in sight. Audible in the ATC radio transmission was a conflict alert in the background. At 8:47:40, the CRJ crew received an automated traffic advisory on the TCAS system stating traffic, traffic. TCAS is the Traffic Alert and Collision Avoidance System on the CRJ. At 8:47:42, or 17 seconds before impact. A radio transmission from the tower was audible on both CVRs, directing the Black Hawk to pass behind the CRJ. CVR data from the Black Hawk indicated that the portion of the transmission that stated "pass behind the" may not have been received by the Black Hawk crew. Transmission was stepped on by a 0.8-second mic key from the Black Hawk. The Black Hawk was keying the mic to communicate with ATC. In response, at 8:47:44, the Black Hawk crew indicated that traffic was in sight and requested visual separation, which was approved by DCA Tower. The instructor pilot then told the pilot flying they believed ATC was asking for the helicopter to move left toward the east bank of the Potomac. At 8:47:52, or 7 seconds before impact, the CRJ rolled out on final for runway 33. The CRJ was at a radio altitude of 344 feet, 143 knots. At 8:47:58, or 1 second before impact, the CRJ began to increase its pitch, reaching about 9 degrees nose up at the time of collision. FDR data show the CRJ elevators were deflected near their maximum nose up travel. The last radio altitude recorded for the CRJ was 313 feet and was recorded 2 seconds prior to the collision. The CRJ pitch at this time was again 9 degrees nose up, and roll was 11 degrees left wing down. The CRJ was descending at 448 feet per minute. The radio altitude of the Black Hawk at the time of the collision was 278 feet and had been steady for the previous 5 seconds. The Black Hawk pitch at the time of the collision was about a half degree nose up with a left roll of 1.6 degrees. Now, examination of the wreckage will assist in determination of the exact angle of the collision. Now, we're confident with the radio altitude of the Black Hawk at the time of the collision that was 278 feet. But I want to caution that does not mean what the Black Hawk, that's what the Black Hawk crew was seeing on the barometric altimeters in the cockpit. We are seeing conflicting information in the data, which is why we aren't releasing altitude for the Black Hawk's entire route. I'm going to turn it over to Sean Payne for an explanation of that. Sean is branch chief of the NTSB Vehicle Recorder Division.
Thank you. I'm Sean Payne. I'm branch chief of the Vehicle Recorder Division. This is the flight recorder lab at the NTSB. I can give some insight into the of understanding what altitude the Black Hawk pilots would have seen on their gauges in the cockpit. You may see pictures released of showing us in the lab rebuilding the flight recorders. That's part of our job, but a bigger part is ensuring that the data that we have downloaded is true and accurate. We call this validating the data. I'm going to define some terms for altitude in a way that most audiences can understand. I may end up reading much of this verbatim as I want to be precise in my language. The first term is radio altitude. You've heard this in our other press conference before. This is a measure of the helicopter's height above terrain, in this case, the Potomac River. It is measured by bouncing a signal from the helicopter to the river. We have determined that this parameter is valid. This is good data. This gives us confidence in knowing exactly how high the helicopter was above the ground. This parameter is not the primary means the pilots would have used to determine their height during flight. The pilots are not typically navigating. It is often different from what they see on their primary altimeters. The next term is barometric altitude. This is typically the altitude the pilots would use while they are flying. This was not recorded on the FDR. Barometric altitude takes into account certain atmospheric conditions. This would be displayed in front of both pilots on their instrument panel. As I said, this was not recorded. The next term is barometric pressure setting. This is an adjustment that the pilots use on their primary barometric altimeters to ensure that the altimeter is set properly. This is critical. This was not recorded by the FDR. This accounts for the local pressure at the time of the flight. Again, this was not recorded by the FDR. The next term is pressure altitude. This is more of an engineering altitude that the helicopter's systems can tap into. This altitude is calibrated using what we call a standard atmospheric pressure. We have found that this parameter is not valid. This is bad data. Normally, we can use this parameter to compute the barometric altitude displayed to the pilots. Because this data is bad, we have to use other methods to make this determination. Last, the FDR does not record GPS information, so we cannot simply verify any of this with GPS information such as GPS altitude. This does not exist in the data set. We are working to determine if this bad data for pressure altitude only affected the FDR or if it was more pervasive throughout the helicopter's other systems. We will have an answer to what altitude the pilots saw on their gauges as they were flying. To examine this, we will use a combination of methods. First, we have already started working with Sikorsky, Collins Aviation, and the Army to retrieve engineering documentation to understand how this may have affected other helicopter systems. Next, because we cannot turn to the FDR for this information, the wreckage of the helicopter needs to be examined. We need to look at the remains of the pedostatic and air data system. I must stress that these systems were badly damaged in the accident, and this will be difficult. Last, we will need to look at the altimeters themselves and determine their independent functionality. I'd like to stress that we've just completed the on-scene phase of the investigation. We need to follow our process and be meticulous. Ultimately, this work will determine the altitude displayed to the pilots and will be included in our final report. I'll pass it back to Chairman.
Thanks, John. What I just read, we are going to publish that online, so I'm not going to take specific questions going back to certain times that I've already read. I think that can get very confusing, and so please refer to what we do post online. I do want to make a few corrections and also provide some additional information on a couple of other issues. First, the ATC group has been looking at the radio frequencies. The airplane and the helicopter were both on two different VHF frequencies, not UHF. Also, just a correction, Metropolitan Police Department recovered the Black Hawk, CVR, and FDR, not the FBI. I do want to provide a little bit of information on ADSB out for the Black Hawk. ADSB stands for Automatic Dependent Surveillance Broadcast. So the helicopter was equipped with and capable of transmitting ADSB out. We don't know why it wasn't transmitting. What we'll have to look at is the installation of the equipment. We'll have to look at programming. We'll have to look at whether there was some sort of equipment malfunction or if the ADSB was turned off. So there are a lot of people are asking about, was it turned off? There are other things we have to rule out first. The team is going to do a visibility study. The visibility study, we're going to do a laser scan of the cockpits of an exemplar CRJ. We're going to also laser scan an exemplar cockpit of an exemplar Black Hawk, and we're going to take that information as well as information from examination of the wreckage, different seating positions, different heights, different eye positions, also taking into account night vision goggles, and we're going to do a pretty in-depth visibility study, which we do often, and see if we can demonstrate, which we will be able to do on a software program, what the pilots of the Black Hawk could and could not see. Now, we will begin moving the wreckage from DCA to a secure location over the next week. And that's all I have for now. I am going to take questions. Again, I'm not going to take questions on specific times that I read through in the Black Hawk route or in the CRJ as it was moving to runway 33, but all of that will be online at ntsb.gov, and you can find that. So I will take questions as I call you. Please raise your hand, state your name and your affiliation. Tom.
Madam Chair, Tom Costello with NBC News. Thank you for the NBC News. Thank you for the update. If I understand correctly, you're looking into the possibility that there may have been a malfunction in terms of the accuracy of the altimeter readings inside the cockpit for the Black Hawk helicopter.
One more time.
Do I understand correctly, you're looking into the possibility that there may have been bad data and therefore inaccurate readings inside the cockpit of the chopper for altitude for the pilots to read?
That's correct. We are looking at the possibility of there may be bad data. We're looking at, were they seeing something different in the cockpit that differs from the FDR data, which was radio altimeter?
In other words, they may have thought they're at one altitude when in truth they were at a different altitude.
It's possible, but we have a lot of work to do till we get to that. Pete.
Pete Munting with CNN. How critical is the finding that the crew could have been wearing night vision goggles, and how much will that factor into your investigation?
So the question is, how critical is the finding that the crew could have been wearing night vision goggles? That is, part of our investigation where it's going to be a factor in our visibility study. We're going to have to see what was possible for them to see at the time leading up to the collision and the accident sequence.
Is there anything in the voice recorder indicating that the crew of the Black Hawk saw the impending collision?
Is there anything in the voice recorder that the crew of the Black Hawk could see or tell that there was an impending collision? We do not have any indication that the Black Hawk crew would have seen that.
Based on the possibility that they were wearing these night vision goggles, we've heard from people who wear them that it may affect your peripheral vision. So if the plane is coming into 33 and they're coming down the river, that possibly the peripheral vision may have been affected to see that plane off to the left?
The question is visibility and night vision goggles. This is exactly why we do a visibility study, and we'll test that as part of our study. But time will tell. Just to level set here, we're only a couple of weeks out, and we have a lot of work to do. That will be a part of the work.
David Gilbert, Washington Post. You mentioned the CRJ got a traffic advisory before the collision. Do you know what aircraft triggered that traffic advisory? And do you know if it in fact was the Black Hawk or some other aircraft?
Do we know if the traffic advisory that was received by the CRJ crew was the Black Hawk? That's something that our ATC group is analyzing.
Hi. My question is about air traffic control's message to the Black Hawk saying that they should pull behind the passenger plane. You're saying that didn't get through to the Black Hawk, or are you saying that is what's being investigated, or it did get through and they weren't able to accommodate that?
So the instructions from ATC were to pass behind the CRJ. That transmission was interrupted. It was stepped on. We do not have evidence on the CVR of the Black Hawk that they may have not received pass behind the, because the mic key. They were communicating with air traffic control at the time.
Did that full message come through from air traffic control, like pass behind the passenger plane, or was it just pass behind the, and then it got cut off in the Black Hawk? Like,
Pass behind the was not communicated.
And what were the next words?
Actually, it was communicated by ATC. It was not heard on the Black Hawk CVR. Is that clear?
I think the clarification of the Black Hawk not receiving an air traffic control and making it through, was the passenger plane aware of the Black Hawk even in the area being told of this? Was that something that would even be on their frequencies? I know this is a second-by-second moment, so I don't know who got what.
So the CRJ crew can hear air traffic control, and communications from air traffic control. The Black Hawk crew can also hear communications from air traffic control, but they can't hear communications from each other back to air traffic control. So it's half the communication. Yes.
Thank you, Chair Harmon. Grady Trimble with Fox Business. I know it's early in the investigation, and I know that the FAA controls the airspace around DCA. But at this point, would you say that the temporary restriction of helicopter flights is the right move, and would you advocate for a permanent restriction of those flights?
Well, I do want to congratulate the Secretary Duffy for taking action immediately to restrict helicopter traffic, except for certain circumstances, life-saving flights and presidential flights. So I think they took the right safety action. We will have to, as we go through our investigation, look at the accident sequence and take our investigative information and determine what next steps should be done. It's too early for us to say whether it should be permanent. However, that's certainly something that the Secretary and the FAA can do on their own.
And because it will be you guys who put the safety recommendations forward in the end, are there any others right now that would make flying into that particular airport safer?
Yeah, so here's what I'm going to say. On aviation is the safest mode of transportation. I say this often. You are at greater risk getting into your car to and from the airport. On our nation's roads are 95% of all transportation deaths. 95%. We're talking 43,000 people are dying on our nation's roads annually, millions more injured. Aviation is incredibly safe. With respect to any safety recommendations that may come along or any safety deficiencies that we might identify, one thing I will say is our investigative process, we don't wait till the end of our investigation to issue something that may impact a safety deficiency. So for example, we will issue an urgent safety recommendation if we see that something needs to be acted on immediately. We won't wait till the end of the investigation. We won't wait till the end to issue recommendations in the final report. We will take action. We will issue an urgent safety recommendation if we need to. So that's open right now in all areas.
Last question.
Yes.
Patrick Turk for the Scripps News. There's been a lot of talk from aviation experts that maybe the crew on the CRJ or on the Black Hawk rather is looking at the wrong plane. Can you talk about whether you've seen anything that would support that theory or oppose it?
Yeah, I've read these reports. It's too early to tell. We're going to have to do our visibility study to look at all possibilities of what the crew might have been seeing. So more to come on that. Thank you very much.